Well, I just want to say thank you again for joining us. I have stressed that we have refreshments in the back because if you don't eat them, right? Who's going to have to eat them? But at any rate, thank you again for being here. If you are interested in learning about any of our other author talks, we have a flyer in the back that lists what's coming up. But at this time, we're going to get into why we are here this evening. I'm going to introduce our moderator for the evening first. Here. Because if I say to your right and left, I'll get that wrong. Dr. Francine Allen-Adams is an assistant professor of English at Morehouse College. She has an MA from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and a PhD from Georgia State University. Her research focuses in part on how narratives of Scripture can be seen as archetypes for exploring the way modern narratives revise ancient narratives. Dr. Allen-Adams will be in conversation with our author of the evening, Dr. Jacob Wright, a professor of Hebrew Bible Old Testament at Emory University, which boasts one of the world's leading doctoral programs in biblical studies. As an American with a European education, he is widely known for his ability to blend a wide range of historical, religious, and geographical perspectives on the Bible. His writing and teaching are thoroughly interdisciplinary, demonstrating how the ideas of the Bible and other ancient writings bear directly on central problems that face our societies in modern times. He brings to his work firsthand acquaintance with archaeological finds and primary sources from ancient Mesopotamia, I believe, Egypt, and Greece. As a testimony to his distinct interdisciplinary approach to biblical studies, he recently received a full faculty fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Please welcome Dr. Wright and Dr. Allen-Adams.
Well, it is a great pleasure to be here with you, with Dr. Wright. And thinking about your book, Why the Bible Began, one of the things I really liked about it was the detail. It's very detailed and your critical analysis of those details. But I think what helped me the most was the way in which you contextualize. Before you even presented your argument, your thesis, you provided really good contextual information to prepare your readers for that thesis. And so thinking about your contextual information, you start out by recalling the biblical account of Israel, those people who were descendants of the figure Israel, formerly known as Jacob, and how those people left Egypt, ended up in Canaan, and formed a great kingdom under the kingship of David. And then eventually, when David's son Solomon passed, that kingdom was divided. So you have the kingdom of Israel to the north, the kingdom of Judah to the south. Unfortunately, both of those kingdoms eventually fall. And we know with the kingdom of Judah, which was the last kingdom to fall, they are captured and led into exile by the Babylonians. And you say that that should have been, for all intents and purposes, probably the end of the story. But it wasn't the end of the story, because what happened is many of those exiles returned home, and they began to repair Jerusalem. They began to repair the temple and to reconstitute themselves as a people. And so your argument is that the Bible then is very much a story about peoplehood, about national unity, about a pluribus unum, about the many in one. And you also argue, though, if we only see the Bible as a moral guide, then we begin to miss the revelation that it provides about peoplehood, about national unity. So I was left with the question, what is it? What is it about seeing the Bible as a moral guide exclusively that can cause us to miss what it is saying about national unity, about peoplehood, and why are those themes even important?
Wow. The overview you provided would be such a wonderful introduction in our courses in seminary. I couldn't have said it better. And it's really wonderful how you gave the whole sweep of that, leading to this destruction, the destruction of a temple, destruction of a city, the exile, the return, and all of that. So why is it important, with regard to your question, that we move beyond just what the Bible teaches to why we have a Bible in the first place? I really love that question, because our national landscape in the U.S. is very much a battlefield for what the Bible teaches. And we argue over various kinds of very divisive issues that the Bible may have a stance on, or the Bible may not have a stance on, but has been weaponized in some ways to make it apply to circumstances and so forth, both for good and for bad, right? But when the Bible is viewed just as revelation with a message for humanity, and it's about that message, then one takes the message, extracts it from the text, and focuses on the meaning. But when we look at the corpus in which that message is embedded, we start to appreciate its texture and how it's been pieced together at the seams, drawing together communities, their traditions, their music, their wisdom, and making a larger tapestry that reflects the diversity of a community that needs to come together, needs to overcome their divisions and rivalries, needs to unite in spirit. And the text as a project of building a new kind of what I call sense of peoplehood or national identity. It's the first effort in world history to do that. It's still, I think, one of the most elaborate and extraordinary ones. And we in our country now face such deep divisions. And yes, implanted in this work are powerful things like love your neighbor, but how do we learn to love our neighbor if we don't also learn how the text, in a certain sense that says that, models the way one connects narratives, your story, your story, your story, to a grander narrative that we are one people. And this is what it means to be neighbors. And this is why we are neighbors. And this is how we do love.
Interesting. So then the Bible in essence is teaching us how to be human. And part of being human is knowing how to live with one another in our differences.
Yeah.
And when we are looking at it purely from a moral perspective, we lose that, perhaps.
Yeah. I think that we were talking recently, and you had made a comment that I wanted to quote, and it was like, something along the lines, as humans, we have a difficult time forming communities. And that's all the more difficult now with social media, with pandemics, with all kinds of things that are isolating us even more. What were you thinking about when you said it to me about the difficulty with creating community in the first place?
Right, because I was wondering, why was there such a focus with you on the ways in which the Bible is, again, speaking to the issue of peoplehood, about national unity, about people learning to have community in the midst of their differences? What is it about that? And I'm thinking, well, perhaps it's because we just don't know how to do it. We come into the world assuming that we know how to be human, but perhaps we don't know how to be human, and the way to become human and to learn about being human is in community.
Yeah, in community, definitely. And that's the key also to the survival strategy that is, that I at least identify with the concept of peoplehood. It is community. One of the weird texts in the Bible is this collection of love poetry called the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim. And the question is, if the Bible, as I argue, is really about a project of coming together of national unity and peoplehood, why do you need poetry of lovers, enjoying the presence of each other, and it has no mention of God, no mention of real national history or anything on it? And if it's about peoplehood, I think this is the key. It's two people coming together and learning to come together. And yes, community is great, but if you can't have two people come together, then you can't have 2,000 people to come together. So implanted in what the rabbis call the Holy of Holies, this Song of Songs, it is the most holy of holies because that's where the community begins, in learning to love one person, a couple. It's not three people, it's two people. And those two people are the heart and the core of what the peoplehood as a whole, the larger national community will come to be. And then all throughout the rest of the corpus, it's how individuals and couples and families and tribes and cities and what have you also can come together. So from the very most basic core thing of two people to the broader things. That's how the Bible explores the question of how we thrive. How do we find meaning and how do we find joy in life? And it doesn't imagine any kind of being off on an island, pondering truth and seeking that existence that is, in a very real sense, the tragic, both ancient Near Eastern and Greek tragic vision of the hero who goes off on his own to explore. That, think about the going off on one's own. It's Abraham and Sarah who go off. It's together. There's collaboration. There's couplehood and all that.
Well, you know, what's interesting about that, I think, too, is if we think about Scripture, which says the greatest commandment is to love. One of the greatest commandments is to love your neighbor.
The greatest commandment is to love your God.
and then to love your neighbor.
I want to come back to that love of God because we had some really wonderful conversations about that God part too, right?
But that's kind of what I'm thinking, that before I can love my neighbor, I have to love God. Mm-hmm. And that perhaps loving God is about loving my neighbor. In other words, I can't divorce community from God. That who God is about community, and the more that I'm connected to God, the more I know how to live in community, and the less I'm connected to Him, the more more difficult I have doing this thing called community, and perhaps I don't even understand what community is.
That's wonderful that the verses that you're referring to is the question where Jesus in the New Testament asks is, what's the greatest commandment? And he said, and the answer is, the greatest commandment is, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, and mind. And the second is, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And what's so fascinating about that is not only that Jesus says this, we have Jewish sources where a famous rabbi is asked the same question, and he answers it almost the same exact way. So both the New Testament and the Jewish traditions converge on this. And what you're saying is that the two go together, that there is no real love for God without love for neighbor. I had never seen that before. I'm sure it's been said in the tradition and so forth, but I'm glad you bring that out. And in the New Testament tradition, when Jesus is asked that question, he gives this parable of the Good Samaritan. By the way, I'm Jewish and I read in the Hebrew Bible. I'm talking about the New Testament, and that's not what I was supposed to be talking about tonight, but I'll do it. He gives a parable of the Good Samaritan, and it's about a guy who is then, cast aside on the road, and all the people who are Judeans, they walk by him, but the Samaritan, that's from the northern kingdom. You talked about these two kingdoms, and they were rivals, and the Samaritan is the one who picks this guy up and brings him to this place, gives the innkeeper everything he needs to get this guy back on his path. It's such a beautiful metaphor we're getting. So what is that about? It is, who is my neighbor? It's not the Roman soldier. It's not someone across the globe. It's this rivalry that you have between, in this case, North and South, the Samaritans and the Judeans. And learning to come over, it's not that we are neighbors with everyone in the world. We're neighbors most fundamentally with those around us in the sense of town, state, our country, the stuff where we have obligations, whether we like it or not. These people with whom we're arguing are also the people who are building our roads, and to not understand that we have obligations and we have to find a way, a modus vivendi of living together, and that is, in your sense, a love of God, is I really appreciate very much. And I wanted to bring it back to that point of, you work on the African American canon and teach at an amazing school, and I teach at a school of Hebrew Bible at Emory. And you were telling me that how impressed you are with the place of that first part, not the neighbor exclusively but also the divine, the presence of the deity, the presence of the divinity in your text. And what really struck with me was how you said that this literature needs the presence of divinity in it, the transcendent, because it comes from a people who couldn't really find hope in humanity. Humanity had let them down. And a transcendent deity, and that presence in your literature and in my literature, we often as academics are embarrassed by. But what you said so profoundly was that to be true to our sources, to these witnesses, to the literature and the art that they created, is also to do justice to and to be honest about it, and that they point to a divine presence in their history, and we can't take that out in some attempt to make it more palatable in a kind of, we have to be able to somehow have discussions around that. And so the fundamental question for me is, can we take the biblical project of peoplehood, and can it work in a modern secular democracy? What replaces that God question? What do you think about that?
That's an interesting point. Coming from a perspective of a person of faith, I'm sitting here thinking that not only does community teach us about God, but community is God. And what I mean by that is, we think about the Old Testament where God says, "Be ye holy as I am holy." Well, how do we do that? How do we be holy as God is holy? Well, one of the ways we do it, you mentioned the Samaritan story. To be holy is to walk with God in serving our neighbors. How do I learn to be holy if I don't have a community in which to serve? I have to serve. Yeah. And that's the way that I learn how to be holy as God is holy. I can't do it any other way. And so it's imperative. And I almost begin to think that being holy is really the divine state that we were meant to be. We were meant to be holy. And holiness is not just simply some abstract notion, as you said, where we go off alone, we wear long robes and chant. Not that I'm trying to be critical of that, but to be holy is to help that neighbor, that man who is on the street, or to learn how to live with those who are different from me. So holiness is a lot more practical than sometimes I think we recognize.
That's wonderful. The laws that you're quoting are actually from a code of laws that we biblical scholars call the Holiness Code. And the Holiness Code has a concept of freedom in it. But it's a concept of freedom that is very different from the libertarian kind of freedom that is at the heart of much of what we do in America, like just leave me alone kind of freedom. Isaiah Berlin, a famous philosopher, called that a negative freedom, just leave me alone. And he was in favor actually of a positive form of freedom, and that is, what can we do as societies to empower our members so that we can truly be free? And so the Holiness Code that you're mentioning, how to be holy as I am holy, but also that's connected to liberating those who are oppressed. It's so central to that on the Liberty Bell, one of the lines from the Holiness Code is on the Liberty Bell, and we often understand that, well, just let everybody do what they want, but no, the Holiness Code is about, it understands freedom and liberty in the sense of coming together as a community, empowering each other, collaborating, making sure that the least of us, we are only as free as the least of us is free, and caring for it, and that's going to be a truly liberating free. That's pretty amazing stuff.
It is. And you talk about, in your book, about the scribes. I think this is really a fascinating part of your book, that among those exiles who came back and started to restore, to repair, to reconstitute, the 3 R's, that there were elite groups of scribes who who began to fashion the biblical corpus, and they pulled from the stories and the narratives of the people who had been part of the kingdom of Israel and the people who had been part of the kingdom of Judah, and they fashioned this biblical corpus with stories about what it means to negotiate a crisis, about events that define identity. And so I began to wonder, because the scribes were so important in fashioning, in helping to shape this book that deals with, the Bible that deals with national unity and peoplehood, what role do you see language and narratives and literature playing in shaping this issue of, again, national unity, of peoplehood, of, I guess, holiness?
Yeah. Once again, such a powerful question. So go to the very first chapter of the Bible, Genesis 1, and it's a story of creation. And we have stories of creation throughout the ancient Near East. We have them also in the Bible. Other than in Genesis 1, we have them in Psalms and in the prophets. And the ones in the Psalms and the prophets are similar to what we have in the ancient Near East, in the sense that they have the deity in battle with some force. Its creation is through some kind of struggle, and that's more of a redemptive understanding of how creation works, where the forces of chaos are subjugated. And in the ancient Near East, like in Babylon, their world is created through the sword, as the primary god slays a female god and from her corpse creates the world. When we come to Genesis, there's no sword, there's no violence, it's all through the spoken word. And most beautiful stuff begins right there in the first chapters, Yehi or, let there be light, the first words ever spoken. Let there be light. I always have to pause when I hear that. And the deity proceeds over the course of these days to speak the world into existence. And that story of creation is a direct response to the imperial story of creation, the one in which the world, both the world, the cosmos, but the political world was created through violence, to the sword, to the empire, the sword that the imperial armies carry, the same divine sword, and carve up the world. And so from the perspective of one of these communities on the margins that had been subjugated, conquered, exiled, they create a story of creation that is very different without the violence. And it goes way back, and it's a story of peace and of architecture, of artistry, of vision, of labor, but also of speaking of words. And the words are in Hebrew that the deity speaks. So to answer, there's a long-winded attempt to answer your question, but language is so central to this project because they've lost power in a very real way. They don't have the sword. They don't have the ability to assert themselves like these imperial powers can. They've been subjugated by them. But in that sense, they turn to their own language. They turn to an idea of a different view of the world, of course, and the cosmology that we have in Genesis 1, but just the very fact that it's done through language and through the Hebrew language draws a community to a text, to a language, to an engagement around something that can become, like the poet Heinrich Heine called it, a portable homeland. He was a Jew who lived in Europe in the 1800s after Napoleon and so forth, and had a relationship with Christianity and was struggled and faced anti-Semitism, but he wrote really wonderful stuff about how Jews carry within their bosom their text, their Torah, and it's a portable homeland, and it preserves them wherever they go. And it's a text with, written in their language, and one can live in that realm, and one can be united around that. So if community over there and on the other side of the globe, they can come together and they can still carry on some kind of national discourse or some kind of aspiration to work together and obligations to each other, and a language that even if we have one of the world's experts on Semitic languages right here in the audience, Professor Aaron Rubin from the University of Georgia. He is the expert who covers all kinds of these languages, right? There are all kinds of Jewish dialects. How many do you think there are, Professor Rubin? Dozens of dialects. What holds the text together is not just a bunch of dialects, but one Hebrew, so that communities, wherever they are, can come together and say, this is where we'll teach our children to learn this language. They'll learn how to engage in this text and in the commentaries in this text. And we'll speak thousands of different dialects wherever we are, whether we're in China or in Ethiopia or in North America. But we also will have a point of unity. So that language, how does that then map itself onto an American context in which we have also struggles with, well, from the Christian right that says it has to be English, any kind of new language that's introduced into the, like Spanish and so forth, undermines and so forth. I would say that it can be used, those kinds of assertions of let's preserve a language, let's preserve a canon of text and so forth, right? Canons can be very exclusive. You are not good enough for the canon, your literature. But they can also be a way of, here's a body of text. Here's a language, here's an invitation. The curiosity, the art, it acts like a magnet to draw a community to it. And so the keys to the kingdom are in a very real sense, learning to engage around a text so that whoever you are, without power, wherever you live, you can be a participant in an ongoing conversation, a story. And you have to know that story in order to be able to add your own part to it.
I like that term, the portable, homeland. Portable homeland. I love that because I was thinking about the issue of language, and one of the verses that came to me was the people without a vision, the people perish.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if in building this biblical corpus, if that concretized a vision, and what type of a vision of community, so that no matter where you go, no matter where you are, even now, whatever nation you happen to be in, you have a vision of what community is supposed to be.
Yeah.
And so you can walk with that and kind of guard yourself, guard all aspects of your life, your political life, your religious life, so that whatever you do has the hallmark of community.
And most fundamentally, it's a new concept of community in the sense that it's not a list of creeds that you memorize and that you quote and say, if you're a member of this community, you know this and this, and you profess this. It is a collection of texts that are very contradictory, that are very diverse, that have law codes in, we have the assistant DA here sitting in front of me, so we have law codes in one book and another law code in another book, and they actually contradict each other, and what's the point? Come in between them, figure out how do these two law codes relate to each other? How do these conflicting stories relate to each other? And so it is not just a code book that tells you very cleanly and neatly who we are in a very precise way. It is rather a very difficult homeland in which one comes together and discusses these questions. Fundamentally, the most one is, what does it mean to be a people? A question that had never been asked before in the ancient world. They had asked it, they knew what kingdoms were and empires and cities and tribes, but a people? And the biblical authors don't even know that they're asking that question. But we can sit back, and that's what the book is really trying to do, is to say, what holds us all together is this question that they're not quite conscious they're asking, and it is, what does it mean to be a people? Now that we've lost our kingdoms, what now? Do kingdoms, do kings, do borders define our destiny? Or is there some way beyond that? That can we be a people? So what is a people? And I try to define that in various ways, but it fundamentally is a state of mind. It's not a state of territory and of power. It's a state of mind, and thus it has to be through some kind of narrative, an imagination, of music, of wisdom, of poetry, of things that evoke a consciousness, that get people to come together and to discuss with each other, to talk. Without, if it were all neat and clear and tidy, it would be boring. And it wouldn't be alive. As Jews, we call the Torah a living text. An Eitz Chaim, a living tree. It grows. Because it's living, it can adapt and it can take on. It's not stuck and it's not ossified. And I know often in Jewish and Christian communities, a lot of people are turned away because they come to, and we talked a little bit about this, they come thinking that they have to believe certain things to be members or to participate. And what the Bible models is not believing something, just coming to participate in a conversation and figuring out how you stand on these issues. So that even in the book of Esther, which is included, and one of the most powerful ways included, it has nothing whatsoever to do with God. So that even those who don't have anything with God, by in the analogy of this canon, there's a place for them too.
Now, what I think is very interesting about one of the main points you make in your text is this idea that unlike so many other ancient civilizations, kingdoms, their stories are oftentimes about the glory days.
Yeah.
Whereas with the biblical corpus, you have stories about loss, about struggles. And so I'm wondering, even in those passages and those sections of scripture where where the name of God doesn't seem to be mentioned.
Yeah.
In talking about the struggles and talking about the difficulties and the losses, about all these kingdoms who are so much stronger and well equipped, is that not in some ways talking about God? Do you understand what I mean? In other words, you can talk about God without necessarily mentioning God, particularly if you, unlike so many other people, are focusing on what you've lost and what your struggles.
So there's a larger, I teach in a school of theology. I'm Jewish, but I teach in a Christian school of theology. I'm the only non-Christian faculty member. And I've taught there now for 17 years, and I'm training in large part Christian ministers. And the Hebrew Bible is a huge corpus in comparison to the New Testament. And the New Testament is, among genres of literature, kind of, you got the letters and you got the Gospels, basically those two. And the Hebrew Bible has all this stuff in it, 3 times as long, and so complex too. And for the writers of the New Testament, what the students often forget is they were not understanding their writings as Bible. The Hebrew Bible was their Bible, and Paul's writing his letters as commentary. He refers to Scripture as not his own writings, but that. And so here's the question. For my students at Candler, there are so many texts that have nothing ostensibly to do with God in the Hebrew Bible. Where do we find God in this text, right? Is there a text in this class or whatever, that question? Is there a God in this text is perhaps the question we can ask when we read a lot of these, like the book of Esther, a lot of stories that go on and on without God in it. The absence of God in the book of Esther is not just because they're secularist. To the contrary, it'd be hard in the ancient world to have just written a text without some presence of divinity in it. When they remove God from these texts, they do it very consciously. They're trying to, through the absence of God, create voids. Voids that they don't always fill. Voids because in their story they try to show that God is no longer a direct part of the history. That the nation is like in the book of Judges, every man did what was right in his own eyes. And we don't hear from God in the book, in the final chapters. Or in the book of Esther, where there's a God-sized hole in the book, but the authors don't try to fill it. And the reason there is they want their communities to really focus on the most essential questions. And that is, what does it mean to be a people and how do we survive? When one brings God immediately into the picture, the question could be easily answered and absolved or whatever, resolved. The whole corpus is very, in a sense, God-obsessed, even when it is, in many parts, has nothing ostensibly to do with God, because for them, the essential questions, and I think this goes to what you were saying earlier, it's in the questions around community, around our existence, around what does it take for us to come together and to find a way forward now that we have nothing that we have long taken for granted. Those are sacred questions. And there is room for all of us, whether you are an astrophysicist who is pondering like the most basic, essential question and do not want to talk about God, for us to appreciate that work, those very deliberate, intentional, authentic wrestlings with what is good for us. That we can, as people, step back and say, that's divine, that's a sacred occupation. They are perhaps not theists in a normal way, but we can see that they are engaged in the same kinds of questions. And thus, that is for us sacred in the sense that what it means to be holy, to go back to your holiness, is life. What is the most unholy? What's the most impure thing? Death. Death causes impurity, and what is the most essential thing for the holiness code is, do this and you shall live long in the land. Life is, and finding a way to bring communities together and ensure that they have the ability to live. That's the holy task. And it is pursued in so many different ways across this corpus. But it also allows for those places where people don't want to explicitly bring in the deity to even affirm that their project, like the Book of Esther, is a part of our own.
That's really interesting. I guess I'm still stuck on this issue of what about the where God is not mentioned? Can we not assume where God is not mentioned that we are to assume God is there? And then also in the places where, again, we see the stories of struggle, is that not a way of reminding human beings that we have no capacity to do community outside of the divinity? We have no capacity, and so this is why we have, in every time there is the absence of God, there is a drive of humanity to again try to do community outside of the divine, and that becomes a failed project.
That's what the book of Judges tries to really demonstrate. The people are doing things, they finally get it back together, they repent, God saves them, and they continue on their own, they forget God, and then trouble arises, and it's a cycle, it's a downward spiral, so that by the end of the book, there's no more calling on God, there's no more answering and all of that. So, yes, that is, I agree, Professor, that is one of the forsaking God is, in a certain sense, at the heart of some of these texts. But we also have to understand that it's not just forsaking God in the general sense, because these communities are going after other gods. In this, according to the narrative, they go and worship Baals. There's different kinds of other gods, and the biblical authors describe them with the term Baal. And what they have done is not worship the nation's God, which is often, the name is Jehovah or Yahweh or Adonai or Hashem. There's different ways of saying this. This Yahweh, the Lord in the text. And it's that deity, not just God in a general sense, that we have to remember is the central one in this story. It's a particular deity who has a name where we translate with a title, Lord, but it's actually not. It's a personal name, Yahweh. And Yahweh chooses for himself a people. He tries through various ways to undertake, through creation, through the flood, he gives up, Tower of Babel. In the end, he finally decides on, let me work through a community, like you're saying, through Abram and Sarah. I'm going to create through this nation, through this national project. I'm going to unfold my plan through a project of peoplehood. But it is very much about this one God and his story of a relationship with his people, or better yet, us, the people of Israel, studying or talking about how we came to be and been liberated by our God. When I say us, Israel, I mean the ancient Israelites as they're writing these texts and reading them. It's very much, they understand history as a story. And the reason why they understand it as a story is because they see it as the unfolding of a plan with a particular God who is in covenant with them. And I say that not to make it more particularistic and less relevant to non-Jews, but to show how powerful that is. And I think that help me if I'm wrong, but I think other marginal communities have understood their stories really much as a personal, almost covenantal relationship with a God who cares and suffers with them, and not just the God of the universe. And why is that? If it's the God of the universe, and there's just only one God, and we are the worst treated, we are the most oppressed, then this God has abandoned us. Because if it's the God of all the universe, and from a Jewish perspective, the Christians who are now, and during the Holocaust, are now winning, then where's the hope? But if it is our God and our struggle, it's a difficult thing to lay out here, so bear with me. But if it's our personal struggle, there is a story to be told. There is a hope. There is a future. And our God is on our side. And does that resonate with you in any way with the literature you study how do you deal with the question when there's only one God and then the facts of our existence are that we're not doing very well? What do you see in your own text, how they do that?
Yeah, I think different authors, of course, deal with it in different ways. But I think about, the mother of African American literature, Phyllis Wheatley. One of the things that she talks about constantly in her poetry is the fact that that God is our Father. And there is a subtle way in which she seeks to speak to social justice by saying that, again, God is our Father. Once we leave this earth, now God is our Father, and once we leave this earth, we will go to be with Him. But human beings have made a distinction. They've made a distinction in terms of race. They've made a distinction in terms of class. But with our Father, there is no distinction. And so there is genuine equality in a divine sense. We have genuine equality. And so outside, I think the only way that I can answer it is that outside of the divine, I think a lot of early African American writers suggest that outside of the divine, we don't know how to, again, do community because we create racial hierarchies. And the only way that we can survive is to understand that we are divinely created. And there are no differences. There are no racial differences. Well, I mean, there are racial differences, but those differences are not meant to be hierarchical.
And that's, go ahead,
No, go ahead.
I think that's the way one deals with it in a very powerful way by saying the problems that we have in our society with racial inequality or oppression, anti-Semitism, what have you, is because people have perverted their understanding of God, right? They don't understand God properly.
Right. And they've perverted their understanding of God, and they've perverted their understanding of their human differences. Mm-hmm. So they've taken human differences and turned them into hierarchies, mm-hmm. rather than turning them into moments of celebration. Yeah. You know, you're different than I am. That's a point to celebrate. That's not a point to oppress.
You know. I love that, because first of all, I appreciate that vision of the world in which harmony, right? It's not everyone coming together in some hodgepodge and then we all give up our differences and somehow kind of compromise in the least of it, all this, but that there are, that we don't all have to be Starbucks, that there can be small cafes everywhere, and that everyone has their own kind of way of doing things, and that there are communities, and it's not right to have to say in this kind of cosmopolitan sense that differences are somehow sinful and that we need to overcome differences. No, we need to celebrate them. And the biblical model is over this, imagines the world, and a world populated by different peoples. And after the Tower of Babel, of languages, and spread out. And that's what the deity wants. And the deity wants to work through these. They want, the vision of the prophets is that other peoples will come and they'll make their swords into plowshares and live peaceably next to each other. But it's not done in the imperial sense in which one will, with the sword, conquer all nations and establish. There is a little bit of that in the Bible, in the visions of how the Persians actually did bring some peace to the world. But the fundamental vision is one of coexistence and celebration of difference, in the sense that we as a people have something distinctive to contribute, to offer. We're going to understand ourselves as chosen. And I hope every community that reads the Bible and appropriately understands themselves, yes, we are chosen. We have our own calling. This is what we want to do, and to through our collaboration of our communities, of our ethnicities, of all these things together, and we're going to have synergies and creative impulses that we would not have otherwise. But when a community can come together, they can do something really wonderful. And other communities can learn from that and do their own thing. And that kind of, I know it sounds so cliche here, but the image of what is lost when, or the image of what is gained when one is allowed to just come together and celebrate one's language, one's recipes, one's land and its rhythms, one's music and poetry, one's prophet, all of that. Not to say that has to be the world literature, and that this literature is the only one. It's kept in Hebrew. It is like, go back to Heinrich Heine, it's in their bosom, they carry it with them. They didn't understand, they would never have imagined that it would be translated into English and that we'd be sitting here in 2023 talking about it. This was a secret literature for themselves that would preserve themselves. And that's how they see themselves, as like, we have a mission, and our mission is to be a blessing. And we were called to be a blessing when Abraham and Sarah. And our job is to come together and to learn these laws and practice them and model justice and model solidarity and model reverence for our God and living in fear of heaven and love for others and our neighbors, so that we will be a nation on a hill. Not in the Christian national sense of like America being the imperial center, but rather a model for other nations of how to reorient yourself from the imperialistic ambition to conquer and to the fundamental obligations to care for each other, to educate. The Bible is so much about education, training one's own children, learning these things, and becoming a people that is conversant in one's traditions and stuff. I know I'm going on too long, sorry.
That was great. It's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
I appreciate it.
That
was great. Great way to wrap up.
We really we could stay there another hour, but we want to leave room for questions. So before we do that, I do want to let you know that in addition to the library where you can check out this very fascinating book, we have a representative from Eagle Eye Books in Decatur here who can take orders for your books. But now we will open it up to questions. The room is the acoustics in here are great, so just, you can just speak and everybody will be able to hear you. So if anybody has any questions.
My apologies for the book situation. The publisher is battling to keep up with the book. Wasn't expecting the book to take off. This was not planned at all. So, so they're having trouble filling orders. But they will take a list, and I can, we were supposed to do a signing. I'll come back. I live all the way on the other side of town, but I can come back and sign books if you want sometime.
I guess just a question and maybe a comment, if I could. I've said often to people, if everyone would have spoken fluent Hebrew, there'd be very little misunderstanding in the Bible. Like the word Adam is not a mankind, it's humankind. It's, God didn't make another person. He took Eve out of Adam and fashioned around that bone. He said, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. So in the Hebrew, when a Hebrew would have read that, they would have understood that because they're reading the language. And it had that meaning in it, which leads to a lot of misunderstanding when we interpret it in our English or Spanish or whatever. It loses its original intent. And then I just wanted to add this thought, how if everybody has a stamp on the bottom of their foot that says the motto Dei, made in the image of God. And, so I feel like, for me personally, that, our body has many parts, but it's all connected. And it has very little in common with itself. Feet and hands have little in common. Body parts don't have much, except it has the blood pulsing through it, and it's always in unity and it's always connected. And for me to do this and this and this without a fight, but we lose that sense because we are the body of Christ. And Paul said each part does its work. How can the eye say it's not an ear, vice versa, right? So there's no arguing going on. Well, sometimes there is in our body, but it's trying to communicate for the whole in that argument. Like, no, don't eat this anymore. And that type of thing. And once we're separated like this in a room, we lose that sense of connection, like our body has it. And that's a struggle. That if we could just, I don't know what the answer is except for the appreciation of each part and the uniqueness of each part. And it has nothing to do with color or language. It just we're all human beings made in His image.
Do you want to? No. I mean, the body, so that's a New Testament development of the body metaphor as a metaphor for the body politic, if you will, right? The body politic, and you're not talking about the political body, you're talking about the larger community, but what you get the sense of what I'm going after. Because within the book of Leviticus, we have the body discussed at length, often with regard to skin diseases or ailments and so forth. And why is that? Why do we have so many texts? Christians often don't read these texts because they seem so abstruse and priestly, and what happens when this happens and all that. And Mary Douglas is this famous anthropologist. She wasn't a biblical scholar at all, but she turned her attention to the book of Leviticus as well as to the book of Numbers. But to the book of Leviticus, and she started showing how the body becomes a map for dealing with questions like you're talking about yourself. What happens when the skin is broken? What is that? What's really going on? What are these texts really discussing? They're not really only discussing skin problems. This is a larger problem of the skin becomes a metaphor for interacting with an environment, right? It tells us when it's hot and to move back and that hurts, but it also has the erotic feel and that is a metaphor for how we engage in the world in a way that's different from like barbed wire fence and stones and so forth that just keeps everything at bay, doesn't allow us to engage at all. And so the body becomes a great metaphor for how to engage with each other and how to hold on to our own identity as a community, but collectively, of course, but also individually. And then the other, by the way, that she looked at was the Book of Numbers, and it looks at, the Book of Numbers does something totally different. It's the next book in the 5 books, and it looks at the camp. The camp is moving from Egypt to the Promised Land, and the deity's in the middle. All the tents, all the tribes are around it, and it's using the model of the camp as a way to engage that kind of larger question of what it means to be a community. Similar to the way, let's say, Herman Melville in Moby Dick tries to take a ship to model a society on the waters. One is in the desert, and it's a camp, and it's a motley group of people who've been liberated from slavery and are making their way to the Promised Land. And another one is a ship of whale fishers, whales, I forget what they call, whalers, but they also have all kinds of things. So you can see in various ways, just to pick up what you're saying, how biblical authors use various metaphors, various things to think with. Like the body is good to think with, and also the ship and the camp and so forth, yeah.
Kind of just looking for an education.
Yeah.
I don't read Hebrew. I think the Bible, if I understood right, was first all kind of put together in Greek. I don't read Greek either. And I think I'm a little bit too old to learn it. But, you know, the problem with a word like Adam, meaning humankind, how close can I get? Is there I know there are thousands of versions of the Bible out there. Everybody has their own translation. How close can I get to something that's going to give me the meaning? The original meaning?
That's a literary question, right? We often have this problem of translation and originality. And the original author, what was the original intent? How do I get close to the meaning as if the meaning is somewhere further back in time, deeper in the text, in another language, something? And I think we've tried to disabuse our students from that kind of thinking, because a text is a living text, and it means something on its own it makes meaning as a text, and it operates. Once you put a text in the world, you write it, and here is, again, Professor Rubin, an expert, it communicates on its own. The author is now dead, in the sense that, I don't want to overdo it, I'm not totally on that point, but the text does. But to answer your question in a more like, I know what you want to hear, first of all, Hebrew is the older language, not Greek. Yes. Greek is a later translation, and that was kind of the first translation. Greek, of course, was the language, the lingua franca of the day, and that set in motion a text that had been esoteric and written for a very small community being now read by the world. And that brought all kinds of new issues with it. Because what one says to oneself, when one writes for oneself, is something very different than when one thinks that's going to be read by the powers that be. And so the best translation, just to answer your question, is Robert Alter, the 3-volume. It costs $75 to get on Amazon. No?
5,000?
And I think
$75, 3 volumes, but it's the best. And that's the one, he teaches at Berkeley University. He did it over the course of his life, and it gives you a good commentary. And that's going to be if you really kind of want to get close to the text and not do all my philosophical stuff about the text being, go to Robert Alton, and I think that's going to give you a good feel for it.
And I think one of the things I would say too is I've learned this phrase from my husband, who's a DA. This idea is not necessarily about the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. And so often when you're approaching the text, even when we don't feel like our translation has gotten as close to the original, there's something more than just that language. There's the spirit behind it. And so I think that, for me, gives me a measure of peace in terms of interpretation.
Nice.
That's good. That's good.
And speaking of that, you know, the Bible is thousands of years old. We have a constitution that's only a couple of hundred years old. And we have people debating what did, you know, you have the textualists and the originalists, you know, and those who believe in a living constitution. You know, what did Madison mean back in 1788? And we have a Supreme Court of supposedly erudite scholars of the law, and they can't agree. And so that question about what was the original intent, what was the original meaning, is something that is with us still to this day in so many different areas, not just biblically, but in the law and I'm sure other professions.
Not often do you have a DA talking about constitutional interpretation right alongside in the audience.
In an effort to be prompt, we're going to end it for tonight. And just thank you so much for being here. Let's give everyone a round of applause. Again, eagle eyes here, cookies there, and thank you all again.